Hey guys, it's Joel with the Therapy Collective podcast, and I haven't done like an big, article, essay, podcast in a minute. We've done a lot of interviews and things, and I also get some feedback from people because I get really excited about an idea. I'm kind of obsessive. Like I get on a thing and then I try and like learn a ton about it, and then I want to talk to somebody else who's like really smart about that thing, and I try and line up guests that have something to do with something that I hope is relevant to you in psychotherapy and culture and politics and all that, but also something that I'm obsessing over and have been learning a lot about. And then when I get on the interview with the guest, a lot of the feedback that I've gotten is like, hey, shut up, you're interrupting the guest. And maybe one way that I can be better about having more of a conversation and not interrupting. I'm interrupting too much. That's not a good thing. Is to sit with some of these ideas, and in sitting with some of those ideas in an essay thing with just me, you just got to listen to me. It's easier to go into an interview. So anyway, something I'm trying out. And recently, this has to do with the topic today. I was reading Michael S. Judge's book, which is Lyrics of the Crossing. It's a really good novel. And the thing in the beginning of it, there's a section in the beginning that I think is relevant to what we're talking about today. So I'm going to read that. The watcher's eyes now give out light. The light's receiver flower, coiled up behind their nose bones, changes place. It crawls out through their pupils, the bundled nervy flowers making a circuit between each other. Bolts the color of limes boil, forking through the busy air. Their brains are still inside them, but the sundown is made to simmer with a brain that none of them quite have alone, and each one has something like it. Facets of the brain's shelled diamond, the cage-strumming man strings out his carousel of shapes, while catgut thrums out slippery chords, and the people watching him are in the circuit of an ancient battery that sleeps behind their eyes, and none of them will know how to tell what has happened, but everyone will know that it can happen again, and they'll say, I was a tree, I was a vine that sucked the brasswork, I was an ivy knot that lived on the milk of stones. That's from Michael S. Judge's Lyrics of the Crossing, which I'm not very far into. And it's a description which has a whole lot going on. Probably talk about that for an hour. But also, it's a description that is of a bard, like a performer, singing a song, doing some kind of performance. And in the section before that, he talks about the catgut cage, because, it's the strings of old tennis rackets, the strings of old instruments were made with catgut. But he describes the lyre, or whatever this guy is playing, like it is a cage. He calls it a cage stringed with catgut. But it's an instrument. And if you think about, classical mythology, who plays the lyre, it's Orpheus, right? And the lyre makes such beautiful music that he can call a soul out of the underworld, except for the one he wants. He has this beautiful lyre. But here, Judge is calling it a cage that is trapping something. And there's something going on there about the music basically pulling these people's brains outside of their eye holes, because the sunset, like the setting that they're in, or the time that they're in, maybe. We don't know if it's a sunset on a beach or the sunset that he's describing of an epoch changing of culture. Connects all of their brains, right? Like, what a wild description. The light's receiver flower coiled up behind their nose bones. That's your brain. It's the receiver flower coiled up behind your nose bone that receives the light, right? The cage, the instrument, the culture, the music, pulls these people's brains, either because of the time that they're in or the place that they're in, something about this setting. And he calls the brain, he says, faucets of the brain's shelled diamond. They're only like a piece of a whole thing. When they're pulled out and connected, that connection, and there's a battery language, there's a circuit language, it's an electricity, becomes something that is bigger than them and also alive, right? So it's this connection that makes something bigger than all of these people alive in a way that they're a part of it and they know it, but they also don't know it. And there's just so much there. And I if that doesn't make sense, that's fine. I think a lot of those themes are going to be relevant to what we're getting into. You know, the sundown's made to simmer with a brain that none of them quite have alone. You know, we are building a circuit by connecting people with a culture that is also a cage. And it is making them something that is not them by connecting them, right? And this book is like 900 pages. Like, I don't know how I'm ever going to read it. This is on page 14, okay? The whole novel is written like this. It's not a book of poetry. I can't really tell you. I mean, I would already recommend it, but I can't really say much more about how to recommend it to you because I haven't gotten beyond, I think I'm on page 50 or something of this giant book. So I'm going to get into what I'm talking about today, which is the era that we're in is characterized by this hyper-rationality, that if you can't see it, taste it, touch it, it's not real. And a lot of that comes from science and this pursuit of objective truth, production, accomplishment, consumption. And the human psyche, that you see culturally, it finds itself just adrift in all of these pieces of culture and images that aren't really functioning like culture and image used to mean. I mean, they're disconnected from these previous myths that used to give us purpose. Like, they're the same symbol that's reminding them of something, but it's something that we don't quite believe anymore. And there's a lot of things that are traditional or hierarchical that seem hollow or erroneous. I see that coming up all the time in therapy now. And I see patients every day that describe this phenomenon, and they don't use those words, but it's as if they are saying, I don't know who I am anymore, but I don't know who I am anymore not because I changed. Because all these nodes and reference points that I used to have in a culture to contextualize my identity have been stripped away, and they've been made foreign, and they've been incomprehensible. I can't grab onto it anymore. But the world looks the same. I remember it. It didn't change, but it looks the same, despite the fact that it is making me feel alienated and terrified and upset. And so it's not the aesthetics of the world that are different. The aesthetics are the same, but the effect that it has on me is different. But I can't see that. I can only feel that. So what the hell is it? Why? I must be crazy, right? Because I'm looking at a world that looks the same, but none of these symbolic images are working in the way that they're supposed to work. And so because the world looks the same, we feel crazy. When really it's our feelings that are telling us that the world is crazy, even though it looks the same. And, what do we do as therapists or patients just looking to find a therapist that kind of gets this somewhat? Effective therapy in this modern world, it needs to go over. It needs to get over its insecurities of the therapist feeling or looking crazy. Okay. If we don't let ourselves as therapists admit to patients that we also feel this pain and that we also feel crazy from these same forces, then if you can't acknowledge these, then how can therapy, or if you're not even aware of it as a therapist, because you are feeling it, then how can therapy do anything but gaslight us more? We see the news, and I see the news when I'm in a dentist's office, or I've been sick like 6 times, which is why I'm been gone for so long. But I feel when I look at the news like I'm on drugs, even though I'm sober. It's just like, what is happening on TV? And I don't mean that I disagree with what's happening. I mean, I largely do. I mean, it doesn't seem real. Okay, it's a bigger issue than I don't like it. It's that it makes me feel like I don't understand what's happening. It's surreal. And, I know that the people on the TV don't believe what they're saying, and they're but they look like they're going through the motions of something that isn't real anymore. All angles of this. and I'm not a politician, I'm not a god, I'm a therapist, and so I'm paralyzed against these forces too, as my patients are. I can't do anything about them. All I can do is reckon with them, and in reckoning with them, I can tell the patient, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to reckon with these things, but they are real. What you are feeling looks true. I'm turning on the news and people are trying to get me to fight about these culture war things, and it's like, I can't really afford American cheese as somebody who makes like a pretty good salary for my kids when they want to have a sandwich in the park. Like, can we talk about that? Can we talk about roads? Can we talk about healthcare? And we're so far beyond that, where the things that we're talking about are so many levels of like pretending to be things that other people pretended in the 80s that even they didn't believe. And it seems so alienating and confusing. So, I didn't understand the line that James Hillman was really, he was a Jungian analyst I've talked about before, but Hillman was really fond of quoting Auden, W.H. Auden, the poet. And I never really understood his fondness for this line until recently. And I've come around to it, but it's, we are lived by forces that we pretend to understand. The real stuff of our lives is coming through us. And by the time we think we know why we did it, that's gone, right? It's, this kind of rope of life is just being pulled through you in this way that's kind of depersonalizing there. There's a line that I wish I could remember from The Prophet, that book. I should have grabbed that book. I always try and grab a bunch of things I might need to get into when I start to freestyle, and then I don't always remember everything that might pop into my head over the course of an hour. But Auden's line that highlights like how the frameworks and philosophies that we resort to for certainty, when we want order, when we want to feel stabilizing, they're just kind of delusional. They're not. Sometimes it's a helpful delusion or a necessary one, but they're not real. And this grand meaning-making system of religion and science and politics and all this stuff that we feel like is supposed to give us some kind of certainty is failing to. And so this cultural dominance, when we put these forces of empirical science and all of these things on this pedestal and expect them to do this for us, but they're not doing it anymore, we are feeling all of this anxiety. And we cling, tenaciously to these conceptual concepts and these hyper-real simulations, because the alternative would be admitting that there's ambiguity, there's contradiction, there's unfathomable doubt that we all are having, and that seems like it would be too destabilizing. So the iconosphere is an idea by a philosopher, Baudrillard, and one of my friends did actually, I don't know if he finished it. He might listen to this, but anyway, he did I'm remembering the first time he told me about it, which is a story I'm not going to tell, but he told me about this idea when he was reading a lot of this philosophical school called the simulacra, which is something that is a copy, but it doesn't have an original. It's sort of a copy that replaced the original, but the original also is never real. So you get this paradox there, because a copy is supposed to be a copy, and so when you say, okay, it's a copy, but then there isn't a thing that it copied, you have all of this, philosophical stuff you can dig into if you want to drink some Bordeaux and make undergraduates miserable in France. And so, like, the iconosphere is this conceptual idea that Jean Baudrillard talks about, which, I'm not, a philosopher, I'm not an expert in any of these things, but there's this idea that the iconosphere is this place, this sphere, where there's these images that circulate and they multiply and they create this hyper-reality that creates the real world. And that we're in this place where we're seeing all this stuff that is like real, vivid, more than real, but at the same time, the images, they don't really represent anything anymore. They're referring to this external reality that is outside of reality, but then the hyper-reality of reality is telling you that this is all there is. And so there's this sort of gaslighting effect of that, where we feel like, the world that we're in is self-referential, it's self-generating, and there's something outside of it, but also the world is telling you that there's nothing outside of the world you're in. And so some key ideas here, the realm, with the simulacra, those copies and those simulations have replaced the original and the authentic thing. A lot of correlations with something like Li, AI or LLMs, so large language models. It's going on now where you can look at it and your brain may think it's real for a second, but another part of your brain says no. Like, I feel something bad with some of these images or some of this writing where you're halfway through an article and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. But you don't know why it didn't work. Because the grammar's right. It's real. But something knows it's not real. And so this world of appearances and surfaces, all depth and meaning are lost. You're cut off from a source that these things used to point to, but it's no longer there. And in this realm of fascination and seduction where these images, they captivate you and they manipulate you, but also they're not real. But then you are real and their effect on you becomes reality, which is sort of what I think he's getting at. Again, not a philosopher, not into a lot of these schools. I understand their influence and their ideas, and when they're relevant to something. I can't teach a class on this, but in this world of illusion and virtualness, it's virtual reality, right? A lot of these people, I think, are anticipating and describing virtual reality before virtual reality exists, through intuition. They're in touch with these ideas, and it doesn't mean that you can see the future, but you can sort of see what society is doing, like this direction that it's going in, that even after you're dead or 100 years after you're dead, it's not going to stop, because you see these balls rolling and you know where that leads, and that's how they come to these ideas, I think. So the implications of this iconosphere unraveling is there's the symbolic order, and it's profoundly disorienting, it's upsetting, and you're always bombarded by these images or spectacles. As I'm hearing a voice of another person that I went to school with long time ago, but it produces this crisis of meaning, and this sort of impenetrable distance from you and the thing that is close to you, that you're right next to. So all these paradoxes and tensions here. And so these signs and reputations, they become unhinged from anything that they used to be hinged to. They used to point to something, but what they point to is something we don't remember anymore. Reality becomes a dead language where we can see the script and we can say, well, I think this comes from an early Semitic language, or I think that this is maybe like a proto-runic script because it looks sort of like modern, but we don't even know what it's trying to say, but it's all that we have to hold on to. And so sitting with that, remember in high school when you had to read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and one of the first line is that only a heap of broken images, right? So this crisis of meaning that is so that a French philosopher is talking about. Well, here's a British guy at the end of World War I who everybody did the thing that they thought that you had to do because it made life good. You put on the uniform, you marched out, you went and you did it, glory and country, and all of a sudden it's not working anymore. The machine gun doesn't care how brave you are. The trenches have destroyed this country, and so much of the Wasteland, which I really like. I could talk about the Wasteland for an hour. I do like the Wasteland. I do like Eliot a lot. There are all these things that you are witnessing an image, and then you're almost starting to have an emotional connection to it. A lot of times those images are upsetting, you don't like it, the conversation about getting new teeth, and this person cheating on their husband, you're affected by it, but it's not good. But then before you can even react to the badness of it, you're ripped away from it. The whole Wasteland is this shifting kaleidoscope. It's kind of an upsetting poem to read, but in a way that is really interesting because it is giving voice to this thing that I think we all feel, not through philosophy and kind of deconstructive postmodernism, but through poetry, and this heap of broken images that he's talking about in the very beginning. I think that's what he's telling you. He's I'm not going to even tell you the story. I'm just going to let you feel a little bit of what it's like and where we're going here. And that theme is very similar to and if you want to jump back and listen to me talk about it, that mysticism versus objectivism, or not objectivism, the objective versus the mystical. That episode I cover this, but Edward Edinger, the post-Jungian, he's a Jungian analyst, and he says basically that there's an objective part of our brain, that what we can taste, touch, and feel, which I'm going to say with more neurological science available to me than Edinger, that is the prefrontal cortex. That's a lot of these event-related potentials that are using the front of my brain. And then there's a mystical base of the brain, mysticism, that is, yes, trauma is stored there. So a lot of those reactions are like unpleasant and upsetting, but also like my intuition, maybe my soul, if you want to get really mystical. These things that don't fit into language, they don't fit into knowledge, but they're still real. How do I know that they're real? Because the person is back being like an enlightened atheist or a scientist being like, oh, you think your emotions are real? I know they're real because I can see every single person acting on all of this archetypal energy, and I can read history and I can see that never ended, and that probably never will end. So yeah, they're real, okay? And these two parts of the brain, the subjective, which is the emotional, and the, maybe it's sort of childish from one perspective, but it's also, if it's overindulged, but it also is like our intuition, which tells us like what our purpose is, and like if we're happy, and if something is just good, like when I look at the direction culture's going with these large language models and these different things, I just know that it's bad. Like I know it's cutting, not because I'm afraid of it, but because I feel like it's moving in a direction where we're putting more and more resources away from the things that make us human, like education and community and psychology, and not connection with nature and to take your shoes off and go to a Dave Matthews concert, the hippie way, but like connection with nature in a way that like we need it to live, and if we don't have a planet, we die. Big things like that. I can make a logical argument for that, but I'm realizing the logical argument that I'm making is because I feel this intuitively first, and that isn't coming from this logical place. So Edinger says like these two things, the subjective and the objective, they're two parts of the brain. One is glommed on as a newer addition, basically, through evolution, and they don't want to be in the same head, and so they tend to kind of fight and repress each other. And a lot of what Freud is trying to describe with the unconscious and imperfect language that I don't like, and a lot of Freud's bias is built into that, Jung refines in a way that I think makes it a lot more universal and explains a lot more like history and mythology and culture and like early latent psychology a lot better than Freud's model does. Like you want to go back to the Venus of Willendorf and talk about like the id, like it just doesn't work in the way that Jung's model describes that. And so same thing here, right? I don't want to lose the thread too much by qualifying Edinger, but you have the idea of the iconosphere, you have the idea of the wasteland, and there are, from a Jungian perspective, at the core of our human experience, there are these archetypal energies that are biological, unconscious drives. They defy reason, but they are still part of us. And that Edinger is going through that, and he has a picture that he draws where he's like, thank God for the Catholic Church or something. Well, I mean, he doesn't say this in the picture, but he shows like, here's a religious or political system that is functioning well, and here's yourself, and it has all these archetypes that it's projecting out, but they don't have to directly encounter the divine. They don't have to directly be in touch with this archetypal source, because that community is telling you, oh, you want to be a helper, go be a social worker. Your church is saying you want to do something with the messianic energy. Here's Jesus, here's the Messiah. Oh, here's the Good Mother, the Virgin Mary. Like here, our culture and our democracy does that too. You don't have to be religious. You don't have to be Catholic. But you're being told, like, you don't have to go out and figure out what to do with these from the beginning of reality. Like you're a caveman, there's a whole cultural construct that teaches you to hold these archetypes. So when you have, and it can be a secular deity, but he even says on his diagram, I think, I'll try and look up where I took a picture of the book a long time ago because the book has long been lost, but that's one of those books I think I've bought like 5 times. That and Dominion of the Dead is another one that Robert Poe Garrison. Like there's some books that I think I probably spent more than like $300 buying paperback copies of some books, but like the secular deity could be capitalism, like it could be communism. And when it breaks down, and he quotes in this diagram, he quotes Eliot. He doesn't say that, but I guess he thinks that you would be familiar with it. But he says there's this heap of broken images where all of a sudden there's nothing containing these forces. Like I'm just going out and I'm feeling something and I'm having to figure out what to do with it. Even if I figure out a couple of them, I'm not going to figure out all of them right. And if society and our religious and political systems are in crisis, all of that energy just hits you. And you can't figure out what to do with it, and you start acting on intuition in a way that is unconscious and that is bad. And what that looks like is neurosis and psychosis. It can look a lot like schizophrenia. You look at some of the conspiracy theories here, and I'm not telling you which one to believe or not to believe, but if you look at them, you can look at the same people, and it's like the next day they're like, well, the 5G is going through the aliens and whatever, and you're like, wait a minute, I thought you said that there was a secret pedophile cabal and that, like, this person did, yeah, that too, but no, there's a new, it's like, no, but that isn't consistent. Like, you're saying a different thing every day, and these things don't fit together. Well, it's because it's archetypal, it's not logical, right? Like, the system has broken to where we're feeling all of this stuff. We're looking at this world where it is failing to contain reason, essentially. Like, it's not making sense. We're looking at it, and the people who are saying these things don't even look like they believe it anymore. They don't even look like they're trying to. And that creates this dissonance of like, well, this world must not be real, so what is real is this thing that I can feel. And there is a danger to that. And again, this isn't a new thing. Like I talked in our Cults and Conspiracy Theories a lot series about how, like, when these systems break down historically, people do start to say they believe in magic. They start to, because, when people are in crisis, they gravitate towards a magical system. They gravitate towards making meaning that way. And, so Edinger is another, and what I'm trying to do is throw a bunch of people at you that are saying the same thing, I think, from a different perspective, intuitively, with very different language. Because I think that when you go into these places intuitively and you confront these things honestly, and you don't discard science and just call yourself a wizard, it's fine to do that. But if you don't do that and you try and understand the role that science can play, but you don't limit yourself by the role science can play, you also are in touch with this kind of archetypal and inherently subjective part of the brain that you just can't objectify it. You can't turn it into a screener, Like, we can't turn everything that we're going to work with in therapy into something that we can assess with a number. We just can't. When you sit with both of them, you end up saying this something like the iconosphere, like the wasteland, like Ego and Archetype, the Edward Edinger book. You say something kind of like the lens that Nietzsche uses. Nietzsche sees logic as a form of insecurity, which is really interesting to me, because it's true. Like, when he's writing, what he's saying is he's looking for these people who are very logical, empirical, either philosophers or scientists, that are looking for these, like, very rational examinations of truth. They think there's an absolute truth that they can find if they can just spin their intellectual gears, wheels enough. And he sees that as this confession that those people are terrified and anxious and looking for a certainty that is not real. He was like, that you would build this monument to your intellect and your ego only when you are so afraid that you're going to die and not matter and be unimportant, and that no one would do that if they don't think that way, right? Like, if you have a whole society build you a pyramid, a giant pyramid, you're kind of afraid of dying, right? Because that pyramid is telling on you, hey, the pharaoh thinks that they're gonna not live, and so they've made this whole thing of, if I make this insane tomb with all these traps and my body stays there, the ba and the ka will come out and it'll go visit my relatives. Basically, everything that I want to do, I have to make it hard, and that makes it real, right? And then I have to involve the culture in it, and that's going to make it real. That's the pharaoh doesn't want to die, okay? The pyramids are a great example of something that served, like, no practical, strategic, military, even political purpose. Like, everyone resented the pyramids. They were a big point of contention. It's only a psychological thing for the leadership, to have that. And so there's like so much truth in what Nietzsche's doing when he says that, science and philosophy, obsession with science and philosophy, with the logical nature of those things, the empirical nature of those things. He's not against them. But when there's this obsession with the empirical and objective parts of them taken to an extreme, it's an unconsciously projected psychological struggle. And that you can use that to psychoanalyze, the author of these works. And there's so much truth in that. Like, when I had a patient come in one time, I've actually had a couple people come in because they see existential. There's a joke, okay? There's a joke that, like, we make at consultation groups sometimes, that, like, when a patient sees existential therapy on your bio and they come in because they want to talk to an existentialist, the last thing that they actually need is existentialism. I've had multiple patients that have come in and have quoted that, what's his name? I don't remember that. Anyway, they've quoted the French play where they say, that hell is other people. And when they say that, I know that isn't relevant. Like, what other people do or how other people, like, the point, what you're telling me is that I feel like I'm in hell. And so that's where I start, as a therapist. And so, Nietzsche's arguing that these more philosophical work, they present, the people that present this stuff as just pure logical analysis that's going to get to this truth. That's kind of this grandiose, insane claim that lets you know that they're crazy. Crazy. That's, I don't mean to be too hard on some of the people that Nietzsche talks about, but like, they are cut off from this other part of themselves that they don't want to be real, in a way, right? He's saying the same thing that Edinger says. I don't think if you got these guys at a table that they would all agree and be like, oh yeah, we all figured out the same thing. I don't think that at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they're responding to solving the same tension, and in a way that is unique to them, which is really what we as therapists and patients, as we move into this modern, realm, like, that's kind of what we all should be doing and teaching our patients to do. Like, if there's a future for therapy, if you want to find a point to this article or this essay, this list of notes that I'm reading, that I'll probably, try to get, an LLM to transcribe when I'm done talking, and put it on the blog, is like, that we have to make patients sit with these tensions and figure out their own language and their own way to do this. If there's a future for therapy, it's that, amidst all of this broken images. It's not more logic. It isn't more of the things that are failing. And it isn't pretending that those things aren't failing. That's the worst thing that we can do. It's in the same way that you can feel, right? You can find your model for therapy. You can find your model for being a person in life, to heal yourself through Nietzsche, Edinger, the idea of the iconosphere, a poem like The Wasteland, a million other examples. If I had, another day, to think about this stuff, I would come up with, or kind of reconciling the same tension. And you can see that these people don't agree. They're not doing it the same way, but they kind of are, right? And that's the paradox. If you want to look for a point of this. So, instead of trying to impose these pre-existing frameworks of meaning onto a patient's existence, they come to me meaningless, and then I give them a framework for making meaning. I think we have to make them make their own meaning, which is harder therapy to do. It's hard to teach because the therapist has to sit with their uncertainty too, to teach the patient to do it. That's why I'm not telling you how to do this. I'm not saying how I do it. I'm saying I'm trying to get you to feel it. When I write something like this. So, by learning to let go of this need for certainty and control and cultivate this sense of openness and creativity in the face of the unknown, the patient can begin to discover themselves in a more authentic and empowering way. But there's long, dark nights of the soul here. It's hard, right? What's the Simone Weil quote about that when the patient is in the labyrinth, or not the patient, but the person is in the labyrinth, you're walking on this dark track and you don't even know if you're going in a circle. It feels like that. That knowing that you have to keep walking even if you may just be walking in a circle until you starve and die is part of the process that you have to face in order to heal. That you have to keep going even knowing that you going somewhere may mean that you're not going anywhere. That you have to go through that. And what is it? Fritz Perls. I got my pearls here. So the Gestalt therapy guy said, that the aim of therapy was to help the patient come to this point where they could live with uncertainty without props. I think he says without props. Which is a funny word. That almost is perfectly referring back to something like the iconosphere, that there's this feeling that we have to conform in order and to belong, and that we have to get these things that are the symptoms of a healthy life or a happy life, but we don't actually have to confront our insecurity and know what that is. He says that the person has to learn, to live by their own resources, which means not the therapist's resources. You can't tell them how to do it. And so Walter Benjamin is another one who, again, I'm not expert on this, but he's reflecting on a lot of these same ideas. And he's talking about the shock experience, that we live in this culture that is constantly causing us shocks and wearing us down to nothing, because this need to have constant consumption for economy under capitalism means that there has to be constant production, which means that the things have to age because there has to be a new thing, and he's writing really at the beginning of the age of what would turn into a culture driven by mass production. I mean, he sees mass production definitely, but not its effect on culture. Like now, think of the news cycle as different in 12 hours. Like you sound like if you're like, hey, remember the thing that was a scandal like 2 months ago? No one even knows what you mean. Something like when I was a kid, the Clinton scandal, like it was like 2 years of like the same thing. And now like you don't even remember what the last thing was. Well, products do that, everything has to be replaced. And that those perpetual shocks, what Benjamin is saying there is that there's this ubiquitous experience that is kind of traumatic and is always happening, and so we don't even feel it anymore. Like we become numb to it. And that those protective barriers that used to be ritual and tradition and collective meaning are eroded by you just having to participate in this litany of consumption and production in order to participate in culture at all. And that leaves us incredibly vulnerable. And it also makes it very hard for us to know why we're doing something, because everything that we're doing is something we have to do, not something that we want to do or something that we choose. I was thinking about that today when I wanted to like hang out with my friends, and I took my son for a walk, and it's like one of the first times I haven't been sick for like a month and a half, and just the first minute that I had, and I called my friend and I was talking to him, and I was realizing my neighbor up the hill had said like, hey, why don't we hang out? And I was like, in my head I was like, well, I don't even get to hang out with the people who I know. Like all I do is like work at Taproot and then see my kids if I have any time off. Like, yeah, you seem like a nice person, but like I don't even get to hang out with my closest friends. Like, when am I going to walk up the street and do whatever? When then I was kind of repulsed by that internally and was like, why can't I have a community and go hang out with my neighbor? He seemed like a nice guy. But I'm realizing that like, and my patients were saying the same thing about like they were lonely and wanted to do this, but everything that we do is something we have to do because everything is tied to this notion of production and consumption in this way that has accelerated culture so much that we really don't have that much free time, and we really don't have that much choice, Like, I wouldn't run a therapy collective probably if I was a millionaire and didn't have to work. I just wouldn't. I would do something else. I would go hang out with my neighbor up the hill. But I think that speed of culture is sort of what he's getting at there. That there's these, insights that everything, and I get more of like a felt texture from what I've read. I'm not at all an expert on him, but it does seem like more of this kind of felt experience of just being worn ragged by the pace of everything and giving, and that being something that's hard to do. So I'm gonna try and wrap this up. But that we're always, in the same way that, capitalism is making you produce and consume these things, just content to have, to sell, to whatever, that's also kind of applied to culture. Like, we have these inner images, we have these outer images, and we're constantly like manufacturing and replacing those things. And like, we can start to be more aware of our inner world, and we can start to understand what we've internalized. I'm trying to take something from him that I can turn back into a therapy point. And some of these images that we're internalized that we have to have, my life has to be this, it has to do that, or culture, whatever. That may be from a value system that's 30 years old now, or just not mine, Like, look at these images that are internalized, because we also project and react to those externally, and make a choice, the things that you have inside of you. That's an option. I don't want to give like too practical a language for this, or too like, I'm not trying to make a new model of therapy here. I'm trying to point to how therapy has to change if it's going to be relevant. And some of it is just sitting with like, hey, what did you absorb from the world? Like, is that a good thing? Do you want that in you? Are you participating in that thing, externally, just because you have this inward image that you can discard? Or are you letting something that you think is like not real in the world, this thing from, that basically is, a symbol or a reality that used to be something relevant that you don't even care about inform your inner world, maybe you should have more of a filter or a barrier to that. Talking about these kind of cultural forces, I think, is important. And so I know I had talked about Adam Curtis a couple times, but the movie that I refer to a lot, because I don't think that all of his are great. I think that they work more. Well, I won't get into that. I think the ones that are kind of metaphorical work more than the ones that are literal. But like the All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace film that Adam Curtis did, that's like a documentary that's kind of deconstructing some of these cultural forces. I really like that one. But the name of it is based on, because I think if you want to pull like a point from that movie, because it sort of defies a point. Like none of Adam Curtis's movies are ever like, we set out to prove this, but what we actually found scared us even more. And there's no thesis. Like it's this very felt sort of art film thing. But if you want to pull a thesis out of All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace, like I think what he's saying is that when we started to make a culture, and it got way worse, way faster when we invented computers, because it entered our, I guess the iconosphere. Like it entered the way that we thought about the world, which changed the way that we thought about ourselves. But when we started to conceive of people like computers that could be programmed, that were just logical machines, that if we made the perfect circumstance to control them, that their behavior would be 100% predictable, that you could design a culture, like that's when things went south, because we're not computers. Like we don't fit into a binary, because like computers don't dream, like computers, we are driven mad when we can't dream because we're humans, and computers think in binary. Like they are machines for processing information. And if you want to say like, maybe ChatGPT 5 is going to be sentient or something, no, it won't, because so much of like what I've tried to say with these articles, with like our line of thinking and looking at psychology in the weird way that we look at it on this podcast, is that our humanity kind of comes from the tension between two things that don't want to be in the same head. And so much of our anxiety and so much of our vibrancy and our beauty as humans, but also like our madness, is trying to solve this paradox of these two things that don't go together, that are a paradox. They are mutually exclusive. Like they do annihilate, yet they can't, because they are part of the same thing, right? A large language model is essentially a just predictive engine. It's just saying this word was connected to these words with this probability in this way. How much money do you want me to spend crunching the numbers in the CPU on a server to predict how likely it is that the word is going to go next to this one? And you can get a really good equivalency of language if you spend a lot of money and your burn rate is really high on your company that's designing this LLM AI thing. And you can get a very poor approximation of language that is writing in comparative essay, fifth grader voice, if you don't spend very much. That's it. That can't become sentient because it is a spreadsheet. It is a very complicated spreadsheet. It is not, there is no philosophical tension that makes us human, which is what I would call, our humanity. So to wrap this up, that poem that All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace is named after, which is All Watched Over by Machines of Love and Grace. A poet, Richard Brodigan, who's I think an electrical engineer, some kind of engineer in the 70s. So this is like so 70s. I'm not gonna read the whole thing. I'll put it on the blog post of this when I get it written, probably by an LLM after I transcribe it. But it was like about So I got the point. Here's the beginning of it. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutuality and in programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics, where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers spinning with blossoms. Okay, so the poetry sucks. He's not a very good poet. But the idea here that is interesting is this person just thinks that, like, basically machines and nature, like computers and nature, are inherently the same thing, and one day we'll sort of like synthesize into the same thing, right? The end of Mass Effect 1, if you play video games, or I guess 3, spoiler alert. the it is so nuts that I think Curtis takes it. And one of the things that this guy did that he goes on about in the documentary is that he was trying to make a circuit diagram of all of nature, because he thought you could reduce all of nature to these completely empirical, objective things. And so he was trying to draw like a little thing of like, oh, you know, the deer eats the grass, and so that's like plus 5 amperage of energy that goes into the battery of the deer's leg, but it has to go through the resistor of the deer's digestive system, and 1.5 of the amps are turned into poop or what, I don't know. Like, he's trying to play D&D with a meadow and turn everything into, an attribute, and that is wild. That's just real wild. So that kind of thinking, I think, is dangerous, and that's why I mentioned that in here. So, these days of psychoanalysis, which psychoanalysis basically starts the same way. Freud says, like, we can take every single part of the person apart, we can label it, we can teach them what it is, and then when they put it all back together, it'll work, because they don't know how the engine of their car works. And it's just like I taught my 15-year-old how to, I don't have a 15-year-old, but and Freud didn't either, but, well, I guess he did at one point, but he didn't teach her how to drive a Civic. So, like, it's like the person being like, yeah, I taught my 15-year-old how to drive the Civic. She knows how to check the oil. She knows how to do this. She knows how to take it apart if it breaks, whatever. Freud thought we could do that with a brain, in the same way that Richard Brautigan thought that we could do that with nature, in the same way that Adam Curtis is criticizing. That, like, you're just building this engine. But that doesn't work, And if you look at a lot of the post-Jungian writers, especially David Tacy, who I really like, I think he's like one of the most nuanced and honest about dealing with Jung as a person, and his like real, he doesn't project on Jung at all, in a way that a lot of analysts do. But Tacy talks about this idea of the post-secular sacred. That's a really good book that Tacy wrote, if you want to read a David Tacy book. But, he has this idea that in the beginning of time, we believed in magic because we had to. We were evolving. We needed to believe that we had control over the sun and the moon, and we just saw these psychic pillars of humanity, and we asked them to help us and feed us and like whatever, and we projected our own psychology onto a world that was dead, and that made it alive like us. It made it part of us, and that kept us healthy, and that was this first kind of epoch of myth. And then science comes along, and they say, like, no, that's actually irrational and crazy. Like, don't do that. What you can do is just label, like, every single thing and then understand what it is. And then you can just you can build anything you want through objectivism. You don't have to deal with magic. You don't have to deal with subjectivity. You don't have to deal with uncertainty. Maybe we haven't figured it out yet, but we will figure it out, and you'll know everything. And so instead of like begging God to help you, it basically, science would, empower us to feel like we are the gods, which is, I would argue, a worldview that is failing. Because I don't know about you, but I don't feel like God. I think younger people feel worse, and they feel like they have less certainty. Yet we have this hyper-real, ultra-logical, ultra-production-focused, ultra-consumption-focused, scientific, empirical reality that is telling us that we feel good. But we know we don't. And the thing is, that's how I know that these are not logical realities, that Nietzsche is right, is because we don't feel good, right? So you can do the math problem and say it proves that I should feel fine, and the culture is saying I should feel fine, and I have all the images and the stuff around me of a healthy life. I have all the symptoms of being happy. But guess what? You don't. Okay? And that voice that says you're not is real. And the first step in getting back in touch with this stuff is admitting that it is real, even though you can't see it and touch it and taste it, and sort of re-achieving balance between these things. So, like, what does that kind of therapy look like? Again, I'm not making a new model of therapy, but this could, like, lead us to understand inner wisdom and compassion and the stuff that I talk about all the time, instead of trying to just strive to perfectly understand and control. And so, patients could start to understand, like, how to embrace the uncertainty of life, and that being a good thing, or an inevitable thing. a thing that maybe makes us terrified, but also motivates us. I had a CBT therapist, which a lot of CBT therapists are great therapists, even though I don't like cognitive therapy. If you code a lot of CBT therapists, they've just done it long enough that they may say they do CBT. They're not really doing CBT anymore. I had a CBT therapist, and he said, turn your fear into anxiety. He said, turn your fear and anxiety into motivation and excitement, because it's the same energy. It just matters how you interact with that energy and what you're telling yourself about it. It's the same emotion. I wasn't afraid. I was excited because I wanted to change. And I didn't know how I would, or if I could. But feeling it that way was so much better for my brain. And so, because therapists, this is hard, because we have to admit that we're adrift in this uncertainty, and that these systems are failing that we don't know how to fix, and you don't want to offend the patient's politics, or you don't want to make them more depressed. Well, they know this anyway. How much respect do you have for yourself, and how much respect do you have for your patients? I mean, whenever I hear a therapist be like, oh, they're just not ready to hear the greater, I'm having to listen to her go on about this kind of narrative, but she's just not ready yet to know. You don't respect this person. I used to see teenagers, and I still treated them with the respect that I would give an adult. Like, who do you think you are? You're maybe just not ready to have that conversation with them. I just don't get that kind of therapy at all. I'm there with you as a therapist. I think good therapists should be. I'm not judging you and analyzing you and deciding, when you're mature enough to whatever, And guess what? I mean, the therapists who say that, when is the patient ready? They aren't. The therapist, the relationship falls apart in 4 years. And then they just say, oh, they weren't ready to go there or whatever. The therapists who say the patient's not ready, I never see them get the patient ready, as somebody who has talked to a lot of therapists for a long time and been in that world for a long time. And also talked to a lot of therapists who do kinds of therapy I don't do. So we have to be honest with patients. But in doing that, we run the risk of seeming stupid. We run the risk of seeming unqualified, because, I don't know what to tell you, so how this will end, so I guess I'm not good enough. We run the risk of seeming crazy. If you have those insecurities, deal with them, and then go into therapy, right? Deal with those insecurities if you're a therapist, because you're not stupid, you're not unqualified, and you're not crazy. But yeah, somebody may think you are. What does that do to you? We don't know how to do this as therapists either. We can't pretend to, and we don't know how, but we have to develop maybe it's a post-secular faith or something, but we have to develop an intuition to know which direction that we go in, even if we don't really know how this ends or which direction to go. And we must do all of this in a culture that has given us nothing but a heap of broken images and a whole mess ton of uncertainty for a long time. That's what it's done. And so for the postmodern self, how does that fit into a world? We can't rewind the clock. The YouTube video where somebody makes an argument and they're like, oh, we have all this woke culture or this corruption and this bad thing. We just need to go back and be the Roman Empire. How the hell are you going to go back and be the Roman Empire? I've never heard a single one of those people, other than they just don't like a group of people, have any kind of idea how you make a world full of billions of people forget that the last 1,000 years happened. Or 500, or however far you want to go back. And they're going to say, remember, none of those cultural things are an option anymore. Could you just kind of forget that? And that's wild. You can't. We are in postmodernism. That's where we are. And we are lived by these forces that we pretend to understand, like Auden says. And, these archaic currents that are coming through us of this archetypal life are perpetually destabilizing any kind of rational narrative or personal identity that you try and make, which can be terrifying or it can be exciting. It's the same energy. And yet these are not obstacles that should just be mastered, I wouldn't put this on the treatment plan. They're this raw material of they're creative thermals of wind that you can fly on. And now maybe you have to surf on sometimes. Therapy becomes this art of presencing the interplay of potentiality and metabolizing things. And if you want to go in an alchemical language, in a Jungian way and talk about alchemy, that language works too. But this goal of psychotherapy in this post-secular, post-empirical world, where we realize the limitations of science and we realize the limitations of mythology alone, or magic, believing in magic, whatever, we realize the limitations of that. Like, it can't go after this absolute truth. Not just because Nietzsche will make fun of you, but it has to help patients develop this capacity to face the unknown with courage and curiosity and compassion by embracing a more humble, intuitive approach to mental health. And we have to admit that we don't know. We have to admit uncertainty. We have to sit in uncertainty. And we can help individuals find meaning in a world that is always going to be in change. Because if you're waiting for the environment to change, like, it doesn't always, especially when that environment is culture. But we can cultivate resilience. And if you're scratching your head and you're like, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to do that. That's fine. That's good. You're thinking about it. I don't know how to do it either. But I have faith, and I feel that faith is more real than what I know. And the future has always been a simulacra, right? The future has always been a copy without original, because the past is built on all these copies of inner images that people were externalizing, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. And all we can learn is to recognize these images inside ourselves and these images outside ourselves, and the interplay between those, how we're taking them in, how we're taking them out, and make a choice. Make it a choice instead of an unconscious process. And, our lives are always this interplay of forces that we can't prevent or defeat that. But what we can do is learn to build behavior and cultural machinery to handle the dynamics of the flow of those forces. I don't know if anyone's seen Patriot on Amazon. It's good. But I think the book that his engineer boss writes is called the dynamics of flow or something. He's an engineer. But we we are lived by forces that we pretend to understand. But we have to remember too that they are lived through us. We are lived through them, and they are lived through us. There's an interplay that we can have some awareness of that tension. And that is scary, because it makes us a little bit less of an individual. It makes us a little bit less of a monolith, or this monadic thing that is going through life, but that isn't life. You have archetypes within you. There are archetypes outside of you. We can look at how these things are knocking together, but that means that you have to let go of what you are right now, or this thing that's completely in control, because you're not. When I was in psychotherapy, I remember that there were all these drowning and swimming metaphors in school too, and there's a ton of you got to learn to swim. Sometimes the backstroke, whatever. And, you're trying to do if you're floating on your back that protective part, it was helping you out, and it was a stick that kept you afloat in the river. But now the stick's about to go over the waterfall, and if you can't let it go and swim to the shore, if you keep holding on to the protective part, all of that stuff. But maybe the sea is just too rough right now to teach patients to swim. That has changed, and we can't do that. And we need to teach patients how to sail boats. Freud taking apart the whole engine and trying to teach the patient how to be a speedboat or fix a speedboat. Not going to happen. The sea is too rough to swim. But we can teach them to be in conversation with these forces in a way that is sustainable, through sailing. And maybe we can build a culture that can learn to sail and cruise ships again. Maybe we can be in conversation with the storm, because it's not going to go away. And if it does, it's not going to go away because of magic, because of anything we did. It's not going to go away because of science. We are in a storm. And I think that instead of trying to swim, we need to remember to breathe, and we need to remember how to use the wind.